Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. We'll just wait another minute or two. How's that? What do you think?
Sure. I love that we have visitors from New York.
Yes, definitely.
I invite everybody to open your chat if you can, because our wonderful Stagebridge staff member who's here with us, Lily, is putting lots of useful and important information in the chat. And also our performers will be putting some notes in the chat, some of them. So you can also use your chat to give kudos to our performers. And if a chat is distracting to you, then just close it, especially during the stories. And we will ask that we are all going to be muting ourselves unless we are the speaker. Oh, nice.
How do you like us so far?
Yeah, this is a good reminder to all of us. Do your, bio breaks of standing up, stretching, or whatever, whenever you need it. We're not going to take a break, an official break in the middle of this program. So feel free. All right, what do you think, Lily? Shall we get started?
Yeah.
All right. Lily usually gives very often at Stagebridge showcases, is the staff member who greets everyone, but she's kind of lost her voice today. So on behalf of Stagebridge, welcome to this showcase of our winter 2022 Folktales class. It's just been an honor and a privilege to teach this class, and I'm excited to hear all the stories, and I'm sure you are too. First, even though you're muted, I encourage you to put your, as the audience, to put your cell phone far somewhere away from you. We're entering into a space that goes back in human history to a time before cell phones. And isn't that a nice thing to visit? So let's do that. We're going to have, we have 7 people in this class, so you'll hear 7 stories. And I just want to set the stage with a little bit about folk tales. I wanted to start with a quote from Milbrae Birch. Some of you may know of her, a well-known storyteller on the national scene, and also a folklore researcher. And she said, the stories we are told throughout our lives are meant to teach us how to be human within the parameters of the place and the culture of our birth. These lessons concern not only how to behave in acceptable ways, but also how to survive in sometimes hostile environments. I think you're going to see that in these stories. So she's saying that all the stories we tell teach us this. Now, what about folktales in particular? Well, Merriam-Webster defines a folktale as a characteristically anonymous, timeless, and placeless tale circulated orally among a people. So there's many different kinds of folktales. There's thousands of regional and cultural variants of them, but they share some common characteristics that you're going to see today. They are usually passed down in writing and orally, but are part of an oral tradition. Coming from a time when most people didn't know how to read and write. Today, we get to read them in books. That's where a lot of us have gotten the tales we're going to tell today. Because in the 19th century, people like the Brothers Grimm and many countries began going around asking people in rural areas, uneducated people, to tell their, quote, uneducated people, to tell stories, and they wrote them down, to capture and preserve languages and lore that was disappearing. So another thing about folk tales is that they often feature regular people. Folk coming from the German Volk, meaning people. And they're grounded in everyday life, even though you're going to see some magical elements in some of our stories. They happen to ordinary people who we can identify with. Folktales carry cultural information, but also universal messages. We've been finding that good stories travel all around the world. They wear new clothes to fit their new homes, and they still speak to us now. So the last thing I want to say about folktales is that the teller of a folktale over time is proud that his or her story is not their own original story, that they have it on good authority. And like a quilter using her own materials and her own color preferences and her own talents to make a unique work of art on a traditional pattern that she's gotten from her ancestors. That's what our tellers today will be doing. They're going to, each of our tellers today, each of the people in this class has brought amazing creativity and heart to all the stories they've shared in their unique voice, but they are going to honor where they received the story from so that we really celebrate that we're part of this human tapestry. So we're going to stand proud. So I invite you again to give praise to our tellers in the chat between the stories. And if you hear a story that reminds you of a story that you know, tell us that, because that's part of what we're doing is learning how our stories have traveled the world. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first storyteller, who will be Anne Reilly, telling a story from early American folklore. So give me a minute to spotlight Anne, and we're going to hear our first great story. Hi, Anne. Tell us a story.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to tell you a story that I learned from a New York State Native American, Abenaki Indian, Joseph Bruchak. And it goes like this. One day, Bill and his father, Abner, decided to take a walk. Decided to take a walk. Now, they knew it was cold outside, but they were tough. There was no such thing as a chilly day that would be too cold for them. So they started out and they walked along, and everything, all the trees and the ground, all had frozen frost on it. And so they walked along, they came to a tree, beautiful tree, and it had some Oh, it had some birds on it. But as they looked closely, they realized that those birds weren't moving. They were frozen solid. In fact, as they really looked closely, you could see these tiny little bird songs coming out of their beaks, frozen. Well, that was curious. They turned and they looked at the next door field, and there they saw a rabbit crouched down. And they looked carefully. That rabbit looked terrified. He was frozen solid with a terrified look. Why, I wonder why he's so afraid. Well, they looked behind him, and there, in midair, was a frozen fox. Ha ha! He had never quite got to the rabbit. He got frozen in the middle of his jump to get the rabbit. Well, Bill was kind of a soft-hearted fellow, and he reached out and he got the fox, and he just turned the fox around so that when he thawed out, he would be leaping away from the rabbit. Well, they traveled along a little farther, and they decided they were really cold. They were so cold, they decided they had to do something about it. So they started to gather twigs and branches to make a fire. So they got the wood together, all ready for the fire. But you know, when Bill went to strike the match, the little flame of the match just froze solid. Well, he was not one to waste anything. So he just flipped open his tobacco case and dropped the frozen flame in there. And he took that up as a habit. He did that anytime he ran across a flame that wouldn't really burn. He just saved them. And years later, he was able to, whenever he needed a flame for a fire, he just had it saved there in his little case. Well, it really was cold. They had to admit it was really too cold, and they decided maybe actually they should turn back towards home. Bill realized to his horror that he had not worn his heavy boots and that his feet were frozen solid. Well, they headed towards the house and got there, and Abner blew open the door and shouted to his wife, said, "Please bring a bucket of water, because Bill's feet are frozen." Well, now, Bill's wife obediently came with a bucket of water, but you know, she brought cold water. I mean, blazing hot water. But I'd have to tell you, in case you're ever in a situation like this, that if you ever have to thaw out frozen feet or fingers, always use cool water. Don't use hot water, just cool water, and it will work fine. But, well, you know, she didn't know that. And she brought in this bucket of cold, blazing hot water, and he put his feet into it. And do you know that there were 6 inches of ice on the top of that water? But it turned out okay. And Abner's feet turned out to be just fine. So, you know, they looked at each other and they finally realized that, you know, maybe there were certain days when it really was too cold to go for a walk. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for getting us started with one kind of folk tale that's told, very popular in many countries, including ours. If anybody can think of what kind of a story that was, you in the audience, and put it in the chat.
I should have said that.
No, that's okay. What kind of story was that? Where things that couldn't possibly happen are told as if, oh yeah, and it just gets crazier and weirder and weirder and weirder and taller. So we just heard a tall tale from Anne. Thank you so much. All right, our next Yeah, Tall Tales. Our next storyteller is going to be Terry Stokes, and he is going to tell us a story. I need to spotlight him, or someone has spotlighted him. No, here we go. All right. And he's telling us a Kazakh folk tale. Please welcome Terry Stokes.
Thank you, Liz. And it's very good to be here today. I'm very, very pleased to have taken this class and enjoyed every minute of it, all the good stories that I've heard. And I'm going to tell you one of my favorites. This is a story about a character named Aldar Kusa. And there are a lot of stories. Legend has it that he has a lot of stories about his trickster, because he's the trickster. So this is Aldar Kusa and the donkeys. It was a dark and extremely stormy night, and Aldar Kusa was riding home astride his favorite donkey, leading 2 more donkeys behind him, each one of them loaded down with 2 sacks of beans, which he intended to sell in the bazaar the following day. At midnight, he reached Alamkent, a small village not far from his home in Samarkand. Now, as everyone knew, everyone excepting Aldar Kusa, the streets of Alamkent were famous for their deep, swampy mud, especially during the rainy season. As Aldar Kusa rode right into the center of the deserted bazaar, he noticed that his donkeys were sinking into the mud. With each step, they sank deeper and deeper. He barely managed to dismount his donkey in time to save his own life and to salvage a single sack of beans. The donkeys struggled to extricate themselves from the quagmire, braying pathetically. By the time morning came, only the donkey's ears showed above the mud. Aldar Kusa sat down at the edge of the bazaar and dropped his head into his hands, and lamented his fate. Just then, a very wealthy merchant named Mustafa arrived from Samarkand. He was riding a horse, a noble black stallion, and he picked his way along the outer edges of the bazaar until he reached and reined up where Aldar Kusa was sitting. And Mustafa said, "Good morning, brother. You appear to be in some distress." Now, Aldar Kusa was never at a loss for words or the ability to seize an opportunity to take advantage of a mark when he spotted one. So he said, "And good morning to you too, brother. I am not distressed. I am just sitting here resting, meditating, watching and waiting patiently." Mustafa then saw what Aldar Kusa was staring at, and he asked, "Are those donkey ears sticking up out of the mud?" Aldar Kusa replied, "Yes, I planted those donkeys yesterday." Mustafa couldn't believe his eyes, or the ears he was seeing with his eyes, or what Aldar Kusa had just said to him. "What? What did you say? You planted those donkeys? Planted?" "Yes, I planted those donkeys yesterday. I put the seeds in the ground, and now after last night's rainfall, I'd say they're growing quite nicely, wouldn't you?" Mustafa was shocked. He said, "I know that rice and wheat and cotton grow from seeds, but I've never heard of growing donkeys from seeds." Aldar Kusa gestured to the donkey ears rising from the mud, and he told him, "Do you not have eyes? The donkeys are growing right there in front of you." Mustafa's curiosity and greediness took over, so he asked, "How long after you plant these donkeys does it take for donkeys to ripen? And how soon can they be put to work after they are harvested?" "Oh, it takes about a month. Now, I am getting fed up with all of your questions. Please allow me to continue my meditation and leave me alone. But Mustafa couldn't resist, and he asked, do you happen to have any more donkey seeds that you might be willing to sell me? Aldakusa showed Mustafa the sack of beans he had salvaged, and Mustafa's eyes glowed with greed as he thought about growing a large herd of donkeys from those seeds. He said, um, would you consider selling me that bag of donkey seeds? Well, Altacuso said he was very reluctant to part with those valuable seeds, saying that he doubted even that a merchant as rich as Mustafa could afford the price. And so it was that a long bargaining negotiation ensued, with Altacuso finally allowing Mustafa to purchase the remaining sack of donkey seeds for 10 gold coins and Mustafa's horse. Aldakusa pocketed the coins, leapt up onto Mustafa's horse, and galloped away. Mustafa got busy right away and planted his donkey seeds right then and there, right next to the 6 donkey ears already protruding from the ground, and he settled down to wait. And they say that if you ever visit Alam Kent today, Mustafa will still be sitting there, waiting for his donkeys to come up. Thank you.
Let's all show some love for Terry and that wonderful story.
And I got this story at a time when I was co-editing Storyline, Sachs newsletter, monthly newsletter, it's quarterly newsletter, with Sarah Armstrong. And Dana Sherry, one of our revered SAC members and storyteller of great repute, and she has hundreds of Kazakh stories, and she published this one in Storyline, and that's where I got it, and I loved it and held on to it for a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry. We loved it too. I'm going to throw in a few quotes that I found about folklore and stories in between. There's a Native American proverb from the Hopi people that says, "The one who tells the stories rules the world."
Ah,
I think Aldar Kusa might be one of those. All right, our next storyteller is going to be Ida Johnson, and she's going to tell us a story from Celtic folklore. Please tell us a story, Ida.
Long ago in Ireland, near a town called Ballymena, there was an old stone cottage with a leaning fireplace and a leaky roof. And that cottage sat by the side of a crossroads, and it sat there with an old ancient oak tree growing in the yard. And in that cottage, there lived a peddler. Although he traveled out around the traveling countryside surrounding that place, he traveled trying to sell his wares, whatever he was carrying on his back. And times were hard, and people couldn't afford to buy much. In fact, he often gave away more than he sold. And all around Ballymena, times were hard and food was getting very hard to come by. And his stomach would rumble from hunger. And so with that rumbling tummy, one night he went to bed. And when he was sleeping, he heard a voice in the middle of the night, and he woke up and, he said to himself, "This voice is telling me to go to Dublin, by the bridge over the River Liffey. Go to Dublin? Why, it's 3 days' walk from here. Why should I go to Dublin?" The next night, fell asleep again in hunger. Was it his rumbling stomach that spoke to him? He woke up. Oh, now it says, yes, go to the bridge over the River Liffey in Dublin. Why, there are lots of rivers and lots of bridges around here. Why go all the way to Dublin? But the third night, he could barely sleep at first because of the rumbling stomach, but then the voice spoke in his dreams and he woke up. Go to Dublin, to the bridge over the River Liffey, it's telling me. And there I will hear what I was meant to hear. What can I do? I've no choice. I've got to go. There's nothing left for me here. So off he walked. And he walked until he was so tired, just as he got to the city of Dublin, just as he got to the River Liffey, while the sun was just coming up near the bridge and its shining waters. And as the sun rose and the day became lighter, why, all around, there were people crossing the bridge, setting up with a marketplace on one side, with stalls selling food and all kinds of knickknacks. And on the other side, lots of shops were opening. And then, as people began walking across the bridge, he would watch them and smile a greeting, and he would look and wondered, was this the person he was supposed to be speaking with? And he watched, and good day to you. But nobody stopped. Nobody spoke. And the sun was just going down, with the sunset shining in the river, when a baker whose shop was at the foot of the bridge, came walking out. Why, man, what are you doing here? You've been standing here all day long you've been standing here, and you haven't sold anything, you haven't bought anything, and just watching. You must be daft, man. What are you doing here? Oh, the peddler just shook his head. I've had a dream. I've had a dream that said to come to Dublin, to the bridge by the River Liffey. And here I am, and a dream, man. A dream? You came all this way for a dream? Why, for the last 3 nights, I've had a dream. I've had a dream that said, go to a town called Ballymena, and there you will find a treasure under an old oak tree by a crossroads. Man, do you think I'm daft enough to go all the way to that town for a dream? Go home, man. Go home? I think I will. And so, indeed, the peddler started back home, a little faster now, for perhaps he had heard what he needed to hear. And when he got home, he got an old spade and he began to dig in the roots near that old oak tree. And there he saw a pot of gold, a golden treasure beyond his imagination. And so, with that gold, he was able to fix his leaky roof and his leaning chimney, and he was able to get enough food for himself and food and goods to share with all of the people in the town around him. And that cottage soon was filled with love and laughter near the town of Ballymena. And that story is told in many traditions, especially in Ireland, many versions from Ireland and in England. And I hear there are Jewish versions and so forth all around the world. This Irish version might be found in this story of St. Patrick and the Peddler by Margaret Hodges. It's also found with a variation by about the Peddler of Swaffham, an English version with London Bridge. The story is also found in a book by Ruth Sawyer as the Peddler of Ballaghaderreen. Many different versions, the same idea. And may you find luck wherever you go.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So I could see the bridge in your story. And I love how you shared, Ida, that these bridges, of course, could be in many different countries and many places. It reminds me of a quote I saw recently from Professor Eloy Martos Nunez. I'm probably butchering that Spanish pronunciation, but he's from the Universidad de Extremadura in Spain. And he said, traditional narrations are a fundamental part of our cultural heritage and our collective memory, although they are not made of stone and can't be seen in a museum. I also neglected to read out from the chat before, but thank you, Rachel, for responding to Terry's story. I think that it reminded you of the Emperor's New Clothes. And there are many stories around the world where important rich people get tricked. They're more foolish. So stories of the foolish and the wise and the trickster are all over the world. And we've heard that. This story that we just heard, maybe again, stories about dreams and advice that come to us that don't seem to make any sense, that maybe we should listen to. All right. Our next storyteller is going to be Melissa Hobbs. And Melissa, I'm going to spotlight you so that you can tell us a story from Scottish folklore.
This story is Whoopity's story, and it comes from Scotland in honor of the long tradition of Scotland and the wars that happened there, and like in so many countries, where wars have continued some places up to the present day, where the men may go to war and the women stay home and keep the farm going and raise the children. A good wife lived above the town of Kiddlerumpet, up on the Bray, the hill. And she cultivated all the farm, planting oats and barley, and she had a sow in her pen who was getting ready to farrow, to give birth to piglets. And she wanted a babe so bad. But her husband, he liked to go into the woods and meditate, or walk all the way into the town and spend the evening with his friends, and sometimes not come back until morning. Well, one time she gave birth, and now she had her bairn, her baby, to hold on to. And she loved that bairn so much. But word came up the Bray from Kiddlerumpet that there was a war. And her husband said, "I do not like the squalling of the baby, and I do not like the smell of his diapers. I'm going off to war." And down the path he went, down the Bray, through Kiddlerumpet and far away. She waited and she waited. She walked out into the street and even into Kiddlerumpet looking for him, but he was nowhere to be found. Back in her farm, she was so worried because the sow was off her tucker, her food, and should have been getting ready to farrow. because how am I going to get through the winter and feed my poor bairn if I do not have any food? What am I to do? Up the brae came a little lady, half the goodwife's size, all dressed in green, with a white apron and a dark cloak. And she came into the farm. And the goodwife told her her troubles. And the little lady in green said, "Little I care for piper's tales, but I can fix your sow for a price." "Oh, I don't have any money." "I don't have to have money." "Well, then, can you fix my sow so that she will have her piglets and I will have money to take care of my bairn through the winter?" "Yes." So she took some oil out of her pack on a cloth and she rubbed it on the pig's nose. "Pitter patter, happy water," for holy water. And the sow began to move. And then she rubbed the back of the ears of the sow, and the sow pulled herself up and began to farrow. And the little old lady said, "Now has come the time for me to take my payment." "Well, what would you like? I don't have any money, but I'll give you anything." "I want your wee bairn." "No, no, not my wee bairn. That's my whole existence." "Well, you're a little bit in luck, because in this land you have 3 days. 3 days before I collect, unless you can guess my name." And the little lady walked down the brae and disappeared in the wood. What was the goodwife to do? She held on to her bairn for a day, and then another day, and then a third day. She walked out into the deep woods where she had never walked before. She walked slowly and deeper into the wood until she heard the sound of water, a little stream, and she hid behind a bush. And then she saw the glinting of a spinning wheel going round and round, and a woman singing. "Little kens the good wife in her hame," her home, "that whoopity story is my name." The goodwife was so excited, she knew the name, Whoopity Story. And so she turned and tiptoed about 100 feet, and then she ran all the way back to her home, and she waited for that night. And here comes the little lady dressed in green. She came and she knocked on the door, and the goodwife opened. She said, "Oh, take me instead." "No, no, no, I've come to get my wee bairn." "Well, that might be fine, my lady, but I know that you are Whoopity Story." The little lady, who was dressed in green, turned red in the face, and she stamped her feet, and she walked down the brae through Kiddler-Rumpet and far away. And so the goodwife had her bairn, and soon she could sell her piglets in Kiddler-Rumpet and get through the winter. And what do you know? Her husband finally came home in the spring after she'd done all the planting. And this story continues to the present day in Scotland, because in the wintertime they do not ring the parish church bells, not until March 1st. And on March 1st, the children take paper balls and they wrap them in string and they run around the parish church yelling, "Whoopity story, whoopity story." And the parish priest comes out and he throws coins out for the children. And the children collect the coins, and it's all to scare away the fairies who would interrupt their lives. Now this story comes from many different traditions and books I've read. The last part is separate from the first part, but they go together. And one book you could find it in is the Illustrated Collection of Scottish Folktales by Teresa Breslin. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Now, I'm going to ask the audience, do you know a story that reminds you of? If you do, put it in the chat, but maybe put in also, what did you like about this story compared to the one that we're many of us more familiar with? What was special? And I encourage you, after each of our tellers, tell them what was special about their story and about their telling. Since we, at the very end, we'll all unmute and we'll applaud for everyone. But since they can't hear your applause, they appreciate especially what you put in the chat. I see Rumpelstiltskin, Tom Tit Tot as similar stories. All right. Our next storyteller is Tom Pulsifer, and he is going to tell another story from Scottish folklore. And before I spotlight Tom, I want to read this quote because I think it just so goes with his story. It's from G.K. Chesterton, who's a British writer who created the fictional priest detective Father Brown, who you may have heard of, but also was very interested in folk and fairy tales. And he said, fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. Please, Tom, tell us a story.
All right, thank you. I'm going to tell a story also from Scottish folktale legend. And my story also comes from the book Illustrated Treasury of Scottish Folk and Fairy Tales by Patricia Breslin. My story is entitled Dragon, Assapaddle, and the Princes. The very worst and the very first of all the great dragons was the one that was named Stoorworm, who lurked in the lochs of ancient Scotland. That dragon had a forked tongue that could thrust out and sweep entire cities into the sea. It was so huge it could crush the largest of castles. And every Saturday morning at sunrise, that dragon Stoorworm would stir and wake and yawn 9 times and then demand to be fed, or else. Well, the people of Scotland finally ran out of food to feed that dragon. Its appetite was so cavernous. And yet that dragon wanted more. It was angry and it demanded to be continually fed. So the king of Scotland decided he should summon his 3 wisest men and send them forth to reason with the dragon. Try to convince the dragon to go off, leave Scotland, go to some other kingdom for a while and visit them. Well, those 3 wise men went and talked with the dragon, and 2 of them were immediately consumed. The 3rd barely escaped and returned with a message from the dragon. The dragon said, it would stop destroying things if the king would provide every day a young girl for breakfast. Well, when word of that got out into the community, the people locked away their daughters, their wives, their sisters, for fear that they would be taken away and fed to the dragon. Well, when word of that got to the ears of the princess, the daughter of the king, Princess Jim de Lovely, she walked up to her father and she said, Father, I have no right to be treated any differently than any of the other women of the kingdom. If you're going to feed a dragon, the women, if you're going, I will sacrifice myself for the good of, that's what it takes for the good of the kingdom. No, no, said the king. You're my only daughter. I love you dearly. I wouldn't hear of it. There must be a better way. I know. I will issue a proclamation. I will decree that any man that comes forward and can slay the dragon, that man will win the kingdom. And my sword, the famous Snapper that was given to me personally by Odin himself. And he will win your hand in marriage. Father, she said, you can do what you want with your kingdom and your sword, but my hand is my own, and I alone will decide who I marry. Well, with that, the princes retired to the upper chambers of the tower to watch as the parade of young men came forth to accept the challenge and to go forth to slay the dragon Sturworm. Not one of them returned. The king was distraught. He was about to give up hope when suddenly at the door of the palace, a young man arrived. His name was Asapattle. Asapattle was different from all of the other young men who had come before. Boy, they were brave and handsome and strong. Asapattle was short, slight, not very good looking, and he had a thick layer of peat ash covering him. He'd acquired it from sitting too long at the family fire. Asapattle was always called a lazy dreamer because it seemed that all he wanted to do was to sing songs and write poetry and tell stories. Well, as he approached the king looked at Asapattle and he said, what makes you think you have what it takes to slay a dragon like Sturworm? Dragon? I have no interest in slaying a dragon, said Asapattle. I was just walking down this road and I happened to look up and I saw the young lady in the tower looking out. I thought she was pretty enough. I thought she had an honest look about her, and I thought she'd like to sit with me and listen to my songs and hear my poetry. Well, all this time, the princess was secretly listening very intently behind the curtain. She thought to herself, pretty enough? Well, I've always been told that I was stunningly beautiful. Perhaps I should find a mirror and check it out for myself sometime. But the princess was curiously attracted to Asapattle. There was something about him. After all, he wanted to talk to her even though he had no idea that she was a princess. So the princess approached and started to talk to Asapattle, but the king quickly said, wait. If you want to talk to my daughter, you must first get rid of that dragon. The princess looked at Asapattle and noticed that thick layer of peat ash on him, and it gave her an idea. She said, Asapattle, perhaps it would be best if we came up with a plan to take out that dragon. Otherwise, I may have to cut our conversation short to be breakfast for the dragon. So that's exactly what happened. The princess and Asapattle came up with a plan, and the next morning they carried it out. The next morning, that dragon yawned 9 times as he always did every morning as he woke. And when he yawned, he gulped in huge quantities of water from the loch. But little did the dragon know that in that gulp of water that he took in was a little boat that contained Asapattle and the princess. They were brought into the mouth of that dragon in that boat, and they started to row past the teeth of the dragon and down that throat through twists and turns and passages, all the way down to the liver itself of that dragon. And when they reached the liver, Asapattle quickly pulled out that sword, the Sippersnapper sword of the king, thrust it into the liver, created a wound that started to bleed. And then quickly, the princess took a small jar of smoldering peat that she had taken off of Asapattle, and she jammed that peat into the wound of the liver. And then the two of them quickly blew on the smoldering peat 3 times until it lit and started to flame. Oh, that liver was burning on fire, and that dragon shrieked in pain and started to twist and turn in agony. And he finally retched water out of his mouth and expelled that little boat containing Asapattle and the princess. Quickly, they landed on land. Asapattle grabbed that sword and whack, hit that dragon in the head, and one more whack, and sent that dragon flying high into the sky, so high you couldn't see him. And when he came down, plump, he was unconscious. He was unconscious for 10,000 years. And that dragon never bothered the people of Scotland ever again. Asapattle and the princess, they had that little talk. Asapattle proposed marriage, and believe me, they lived a long and happy life.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, that story was a traditional adventure tale with some non-traditional heroes, right? Asapattle and the princess, not the kind that are in many. Well, our next story from storyteller Eleanor Clement Glass also has an unlikely hero, but of a very different kind, from a very different part of the world. This story is from the traditions of Bhutan. Please, Eleanor, tell us a story.
Once there was a little bird. It was a little parrot, and she had fluffy gray feathers. What she liked to do more than anything in the whole wide world was to fly. She was very good at it too, because every day she flew. Sometimes she would fly up, 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 and break through the tree canopy. of the beautiful forest where she lived. She flew into the blue sky and she would zoom across the treetops. Sometimes she flew slowly and watched the cloud formations. Sometimes when she would wake, she would fly down and she would wind through the trees looking for her woodland friends. Hi, Badger. Hello, Squirrel. Hello, Bear. Now, sometimes Little Bird would come out of her tree and she would fly over to the campground that was on one side of the forest. She liked to sit on a branch and watch the goings on of the humans there. She saw that they made tents. She saw that they made fires within the protective stones at the campground. And sometimes they would tell stories and sing around that fire. Sometimes if she was early, she would see the humans break off into little groups and they would wander through the forest. She liked to follow them and see their admiration for the huge, beautiful trees and hear the muted squeals as they saw little woodland creatures. They loved the forest as much as she did. Sometimes she would fly to the other side. And there at the border of the forest was a river. Sometimes it was raging and bubbling over the rocks white. And sometimes it was a shimmering green glass. Now one day, the little gray bird flew over to the campground and sat on the branch. And she saw something curious. There were 4 little boys, maybe 10 or 12 years old, and they were building a tower of logs right in the protective circle of stones. It kept getting higher and higher, and they were taking paper and filling it, and they were throwing more twigs on it. She started to worry and kept watching. It got higher and higher, and soon it was higher, almost as high as they could reach. One of the little boys took out a can and threw it on the fire. It smelled bad, what he was throwing on it. And then each of the little boys took out a little box, and it had a match in it. Each of them scraped the matchbox, and then together they chanted 1, 2, 3, and they threw their little lit matches into the fire, and it exploded into flame, much to the delight of the little boys. But soon they weren't smiling and laughing anymore. The fire was so hot, they had to step away, and it was so high. And soon the fire toppled over past the protective stones, and it snaked its way over to a tree through all the twigs and dried pine needles, and it climbed up the tree. The children were afraid. They started yelling, "Fire! Fire!" And then the fire leapt onto a picnic table, and that burst into flames. And then it leaped to another tree and climbed up that one. The children were frightened. Their faces were round with terror. Fire! Fire! The human adults came and grabbed the children and put them in the car, and the car peeled out as quickly as it could. Little bird started flying as fast as she could through the forest, yelling, "Get out, fire, fire." And when she ended up at the river where all of the woodland creatures gathered, they were all staring at the fire. Oh, and lamenting, miserable, thinking about their lost homes. And the trees, they moaned and they screamed in agony. Little bird, the little gray parrot said, "We must do something. We must help. If we all help, we could put the fire out and save our forest. Oh, no, said the little badger. No, no, no. It's too hot. It's way too hot. That would be crazy. There's nothing we could do. That fire is too hot and too large for us. But the little bird said, we must do something. And she plunged into the river. She filled her little gray feathers with water, and she took some water in her little beak. And she flew up over the treetops to the center of the fire, and she dropped the water. It just hissed and sizzled. She looked around and she saw other birds, flocks of birds just flying away from the forest as fast as they could. She flew back to the river, and she dunked herself again and flew back to the forest and dropped the water. Then she flew again, back and forth. She went back to the river and then back to the trees. And the little forest creatures followed her with their eyes worried. Now it so happened that there were 3 goddesses who were floating by on a cloud way up high. They looked down. What is that little bird doing? Oh, that is crazy, said one of them. She's trying to put out the fire by herself. Oh no, that little bird could not possibly think she can put out the fire. And that goddess turned herself into a beautiful golden eagle and flew down right beside the little bird. Little bird, she said, why are you doing this? There's no way you can put out the fire. Well, I must do something. I have to do something to save our home, and I can fly. That's what I can do. So I'm trying to do that. And the big golden eagle flew back to the clouds where her friends were. She said, that little bird is flying back and forth, trying to put out the fire. She's sacrificing herself until either the fire is out or she dies. Well, that little bird was getting tired, and her eyes were turning red, irritated by the fire. Her little gray feathers were getting singed, and her little beak and her little feet were starting to show cracks. But she kept on going from the river back to the forest. The golden eagle said, we must do something. We can help. And turned herself back into a golden eagle, and she swooped under little bird, and she said, little bird, I'm going to fly under you, land on my back, and together we shall put out the fire. Well, the other 2 goddesses, they were so moved by the compassion of the little bird and their friend that they too turned themselves into eagles and flanked either side of the big golden eagle. They began to fly back and forth over the forest. And they were so moved by the little bird that they began to cry. And as their tears fell onto the forest, the fire began to go out. Back and forth they went. The little bird was crying tears of joy, and her tears mingled with the tears, the healing tears of the goddess. Soon the fire was out completely. It was smoking. And the birds took little bird back to her friends right by the shore of the river. They deposited her there gently. And the other animals were cheering, yay, little bird, you were so brave. You had such compassion for us. Thank you for you and your friends who joined you to put out the fire and save our homes. And the trees, even with their burned branches, said, thank you, they whispered. And the big eagles, they circled the little bird with their wings, and they cried their last tears that fell on the bird. And that little parrot's wings began to transform. They became yellow as the sun, and some were red and orange like the fire, and blue like the river, and green like her beloved forest. Little Bird was getting as beautiful on the outside as she already was on the inside. Little Bird was so happy she flew way up into the sky, and she did loop-de-loops of happiness and then swooped back to her friends. She had done what she could. And you know, it was enough. Thank you. This story is from Bhutan, ancient India, as well. It's a Jakarta story, and Jakarta stories are from Buddhist teachings when the Buddha was entering different past lives. And this story that I found, The Brave Little Parrot, was in this book by Rafe Martin. It's The Brave Little Parrot, and it's a different version. I adapted it from that version, so you can find this one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Beautiful story. Well, we've come to our last story, and our last storyteller will be Jean Hale, and she's going to tell us a story from the Middle East. And let me spotlight you, Jean, and please tell us a story.
Thank you, Liz. Talia's face was like a complicated map. It was full of ridges and valleys and wrinkles. Her back was bent over, and when she walked, she shuffled. But she had a twinkle in her eye and a kind heart, and always a good word for her neighbors, her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren. Most of the time now, she sat in her rocking chair and looked out over her garden. She loved looking at the little butterflies as they would come out of their cocoons and fly freely. And by her window, she had a special seeds for the hummingbirds who would come right up and look in. Oh, life was good. One morning, as she sat looking in her garden, she thought to herself, oh, there is something I must do. And she made a brave decision. She picked up the phone and called. A few hours later, a delivery man came, rang the bell. Slowly, she made her way to the door, and he brought in a very tall, thin parcel. She directed him to put it in the corner of her garden, and he kindly brought her spade and her outdoor chair and some iced tea to put on the table next to her. She thanked him, and he left. Now Talia picked up the spade and slowly, very slowly, she moved the earth little by little. She did sit down many times that day, and she drank a lot of iced tea. But finally she was satisfied. There was a large hole. She moved and rotated that thin, tall parcel until kerplunk, into the hole it went. And then she unwrapped that lovely package. She sat back and admired it, and you know what it was. A lovely small sapling tree. Well, now it was time to fill the hole, and slowly, very slowly, she moved that spade and that dirt until she was satisfied. Now, just then, her neighbor was returning from work, and her neighbor looked over the fence. Talia, what are you doing? Talia, are you planting a tree at your age? Oh, no, ridiculous. What kind of tree is that? It kind of looks like an almond tree. It is an almond tree. But Talia, the almonds won't grow for quite a few years. That's all right. Do you see way off in the distance at the other end of the garden? Do you see that old almond tree? That tree was planted by my great-grandmother. When I was a little girl, I would climb up into its branches and I felt strong and safe. When I was a young woman, I took its beautiful tiny pink blossoms and I put them in my hair. I think that's how my husband first noticed me. When I was a mother, I would take the almonds and roast them, and everyone said they were the most delicious almonds. Then as a grandmother, I sat under the shade of the tree. But now, as you can see, it is bent over and some of its branches are broken. And no, I said, I can't believe I've never planted a tree in my whole life. I must plant a tree for my great-grandchildren. The neighbor agreed. And it made her think. She said, you know, Talia, you're making me think of a story that my grandfather used to tell me from Turkey about Nasreddin Hoxha. When he was out one day, and he was quite old at that time, and his neighbors were making fun of him because he was planting a tree, and they said, but Nasreddin, you'll never get to see this tree, the fruit of this tree. Well, he said, do you think it is for me, or is it for the next generation? For when I came into the world, there were wonderful trees all around, and I must do my part. Talia said, come, my friend, come have some tea with me, because I want to tell you the story that I'm remembering. That it's in one of Penina Shram's books. It's from the Talmud, and it's about Honi, H-O-N-I, Honi, the circle maker, Honi the wise, who when he didn't quite understand things in this world, he would ask questions. And one day he too was out walking, and he too saw an old man planting trees, and he said, how long will it take for these trees to bear fruit? 70 years, perhaps. Well, do you expect to live another 70 years? The carob trees that are all around me were planted by my father and my grandfather, so I too must plant a tree for those who come after me. And so the two neighbors sat down together for more tea, and the neighbor had actually brought some dinner for them to share that night, and they continued to tell stories. Thank you. And I thank you, Liz, for this wonderful class. And I'm the only East Coast person here, and it's been my delight and my honor to participate with all of you from California, from Stagebridge in Oakland, California. This is one of the wonders of being on Zoom. So I thank all of you.
Thank you, Jean. I'm going to put, Jean asked me to put the name of the book. Yes.
And I did want to show this modern book, which is called Ancient Stories for Modern Times. And this is by the storyteller Faye Mogensen in Victoria, British Columbia. So this is my adaptation of her story. And Margaret Reed MacDonald mentions the Nasreddin story, Nasreddin Hoja, in her Earth Care book. So thank you again.
Thank you, Jean. That was a perfect story to end our program. I think a perfect story for Stagebridge, about the connection between the generations, about our legacy, about continuing to be vital and contribute no matter what our age. And also to show how these stories have a good story travels so widely. I'd just like to end our program with one final quote. And after thanking all the storytellers, I'm going to read this quote, then we're going to unmute all of us and give our applause to all our storytellers. So this is from Barry Lopez. Some of you may know him, a beautiful author of both adult and children's books. And his book, Crow and Weasel, is one that I read to my children and that just really entered our hearts. And one of the characters is Badger. And Badger says, if stories come to you, care for them. He's telling Crow and Weasel, who are on a journey. They don't know where. If stories come to you, care for them and learn to give them away where they are needed. Sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. So we've been so nourished by these stories today. So let's all unmute and give our applause to these wonderful storytellers and their stories.
Yeah, Matt. Here.
All right, so we're going to stop the recording.
No, it's not. All right.